Welcome to UCLA L&D Levy Center for Jewish Studies. My name is Aomar Boum. I'm an associate professor of anthropology and Near Eastern languages and cultures at UCLA. On behalf of the UCLA L&D Levy Center for Jewish Studies, I would like to welcome you to the Maurice Amado program in Sephardic Studies, highlighting Professor Alma Heckman and her recent book, The Sultan's Communist, Moroccan Jews in the Politics of Belonging. We would like to thank you for staying socially distant and intellectually engaged by joining us for these virtual events. I also want to thank the L&D Levy Center staff for making all the arrangements for this event. This event is also part of the Moroccan Jewish Studies initiative of the Levy Center. Dr. Heckman's book is available through Stanford University Press and wherever books are sold. Before I introduce our guests, Dr. Heckman and Dr. Silver, I would like to make a statement on the value of this book as a way to provide a larger context for the discussion. The Sultan's Communist is about one possibility, among others, in post-independence Moroccan Jewish engagements in and with politics. It is a work that puts into historical perspective how a number of Moroccan Jewish figures saw themselves as participants in national issues. While Dr. Heckman ventures into the world of post-independence Moroccan politics through the political biographies of these independent and sometimes dissident political Jewish voices, the book serves as a reminder to experts in Jewish studies and Middle Eastern studies that in the MENA region, Jews and politics are not incongruent. While we know examples of Jewish political participations, mostly in the context of courts, Dr. Heckman's work is one of the first attempts to put together these leftist and communist stories in one narrative. Going against the traditional stereotypes, at least in Morocco that I'm familiar with, that Jews do not do politics. These individuals believed in the principle of religion belongs to God and the nation belongs to all. As they spoke their minds about their aspirations of democratic post-independence nation state, economic, educational, and social policies, Palestinian conflict, and even the Saharan question. However, I would like to remind our audience that these Jewish communists should be understood in a larger national political landscape where other Jews opted to work under different political umbrellas as so-called core Jews or working with political parties, labor unions, and in the government. For instance, led by Albert Aflalo, many Jews joined the Istiqlal Party as members of a pro-Entente movement in 1956 known as Al-Wifaq. While the Al-Wifaq project failed, many Jews remained active in local municipalities, at least in the 1960s and 70s. During the early years of post-independence period, Moroccan Jews were active in the political process of government and in governance. Many were close allies of political leaders, including Mehdi Ben Barka. The work of Dr. Heckman and of Moroccan scholars such as Hatimi and Bourass is a nudge for more research on Moroccan Jews in labor unions, in political parties, and in municipal government. In 2007, for instance, Magoy Kakon entered the legislative elections as a member of the Center Social Party. Kakon would have been the first Moroccan Jewish woman to enter the parliament had she won the seat, and the third Jewish Moroccan after Mayor Obeida in 1963, representing Casablanca, and Joe Ohana in 1984 for Essaouira. While some Moroccan Jews tried through different political parties to join the parliament, including Simon Levy, that Dr. Heckman did a lot of work on, and Elil Baz and others, the majority participated actively or as active participants in municipal elections. These stories highlight that at least in the early stages of independence, Jews had different political choices, including communism. In the post-normalization deal between the United States, Israel, and Morocco, members of the Moroccan parliament are today debating new partnerships with representatives of Israeli government, most of whom are of Moroccan descent. In fact, Simon Skira, the president of the Federation of Moroccan Judaism in France, was rumored to be a ticket in the upcoming parliament election in Morocco as a member of the Authenticité et Modernité Party, otherwise known as PAM. These recent developments open new research venues, not only about Moroccan Jews in the Knesset, but also the future relationship of these politicians with Morocco. After all, Moroccan Jews don't lose citizenship. With that said, let me now introduce our guest. Dr. Alma Rachel Heckman is the Neufeld-Levin Chair of Holocaust Studies, an assistant professor of history and Jewish studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She specializes in modern Jewish history of North Africa and the Middle East, and with an interest in citizenship, political transformations, transnationalism, and empire. Her first book that I just mentioned and I just showed, let me show it again for the people, because I really want to encourage you to buy the book, The Sultan's Communists, Moroccan Jews, and the Politics of Belonging, recently published by Stanford University Press in 2021. Additionally, she's working on a co-edited volume examining Jews in radical politics in a comparative framework. She has held fellowships with Fulbright, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and has published her work in a number of journals and edited volumes. Dr. Christopher Silver is the Siegel Family Assistant Professor in Jewish History and Culture in the Department of Jewish Studies at McGill University in Canada. He earned his PhD in history from UCLA, just like my dear friend, Dr. Heckman. He is the author of numerous articles on history and music in North Africa, including most recently in the International Journal of Middle East Studies. And also I'm looking forward to his really upcoming book, which will probably soon, very, very soon. So without further ado, I invite you to listen to this conversation between Dr. Heckman and Dr. Silver. Thank you.
Alma, first of all, I wanted to say congratulations. I don't need to tell you, but I want to tell you that this is such an accomplishment, this book. And it's an accomplishment for so many reasons, and just one of them being the span of the project. The 20th century through the 21st century. There's that temporal span, and also the fact that so much of this book resonates with our current geopolitical moment. So just again, congratulations and hats off to you for this wonderful work. I wanted to start off by asking you how you happened upon this story of a minority within a minority, as you call it, and what your archival lead was. In other words, sort of what got you started in this arena, and then as you moved forward, how did you determine that there was a there, that there was more than that first encounter that prompted you on this journey?
Yeah, thank you. And that's a perfect segue into my little 10-minute presentation, actually. It's like you read my mind. Okay, perfect. Excellent. Yeah, so how I got interested in this topic. Well, the way I got interested in the topic was through meeting this man who you see pictured on the right-hand side, Simon Levy. And he was one of the founding directors of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, or the Moroccan Jewish Museum, Heritage and Foundation in Casablanca, or in this nice leafy suburb of Oasis just outside of Casablanca. And I got to know him in the context of being a Fulbright Fellow in Morocco in this year between undergrad and starting graduate school. And I was doing all sorts of things, documenting cemeteries, documenting synagogues, traveling all over the country and trying to learn about Jewish sites. And for the most part, most of what I was looking at and documenting were sites of the Jewish past and not so much sites of the Jewish present. I knew there was a current Jewish community in Morocco, but I knew it was also dwindling and I knew it was aging. And I wasn't that engaged with the more recent Moroccan Jewish political past. And as part of my Fulbright, I started volunteering at the Moroccan Jewish Heritage Museum. And I was mostly working in their archives. They had this Rabat Geniza project, and I was logging in the documents in a kind of finding aid for future historians, that kind of thing. And that work brought me in contact with Sion Levy, who was quite a character. You might even be able to read it a little bit in his expression in this photograph, but he was deeply passionate about his overall thesis that Moroccan history was Jewish history and Jewish history was Moroccan history, and that the two were inextricable from one another. And in the course of my time volunteering there, over many different Friday couscous lunches, he told me different stories about himself, including stories about his past political activism. Sion Levy had been this leading member in the Moroccan Communist Party since the early 1950s in the struggle for national liberation from French and Spanish colonial rule that was ultimately achieved in 1956. And I had never met somebody like Levy before. I had heard a little bit. I hadn't really plunged deep into the historiography yet about Jews and political movements across the wider region. So I really wasn't that familiar with the story of Jews that chose to stay in Morocco. I was much more familiar with the story of Jews that chose to leave Morocco during the 1950s and 1960s. And here was this walking major political figure who was willing to tell me his story. And so I began to wonder how exceptional Sion Levy was, how many others were like him, how many other Jews had been part of the Moroccan Communist Party and had been part of this struggle to militate for national independence, for freedom from colonial rule. And so the research itself took me to archives between Morocco, France, Spain, Israel, the United Kingdom, and the United States, researching in a few different languages, notably French, Arabic, Spanish, Hebrew, and English. And the book discusses the colonial period as well as the post-colonial period into the moment of mass migration of Moroccan Jews in the 1950s and 1960s, and then into the 1990s transition from the Cold War politics of Morocco, which had quite a lot to do with the Jewish past, and Jewish political engagement, into the phase of the global war on terror and the sort of post 9/11 world. And that had a lot to do with how narratives of the Jewish past were presented as well. And throughout that major time period, throughout the book's time period, starting in the 1920s through into the 1990s, there is this major transformation of these figures like Sion Levy and like some of the others that I'll introduce you to in a moment, that had been rather marginal to the Jewish community at large. They had been pariahs of the Jewish community because they represented a kind of political liability for the stability of those communities. Those communities didn't want to particularly rock the boat by seeming as though they were dissidents, either against the French or Spanish governments or against the post-independence government. And their transition really from those pariahs to some of the most famous of Moroccan Jews today that are, I mean, even after their death, they're well represented and they've become these symbols of Morocco's exceptionalism and tolerance of Jews in the region, despite their origins as political dissidents and kind of pariahs, both of the political sphere, the majority political sphere, and the majority Jewish sphere. But to get into all of them, here are some of these figures. They are Leon Renee Sultan, and I have their birth and death dates listed here. Leon Renee Sultan, Edmond Amran al-Maleh, Abraham Serfati, Simon Levy, and Sion Asidon, and they each represent a sort of different generation of leftist Jewish politics. Not all of them were members of the Moroccan Communist Party. Sion Asidon, notably, was not a member of the Moroccan Communist Party, but all the previous four were. And I use their lives as an opening point for an examination for the different chapters of Moroccan Jewish political history, examining the different phases of Moroccan Jewish political history. And there are a few different paradigms that I work within as well, that were all disrupted, according to the nationalist narrative, by colonial rule. And the first one is dhimmi status, literally protected in Arabic. This idea from the earliest years of Muslim rule in the Middle East and North Africa, that there was an obligation to protect the Ahl al-Kitab, or the people of the book, the dhimmis, notably Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians in the Persian case. And in exchange for protection, for being allowed to maintain their religious practice, to maintain their communities, there was an exchange of some restrictions as well, notably paying a poll tax to whatever ruler was in charge, some sartorial restrictions, some building restrictions. And it's important to note, though, that dhimmi status was not consistent over time and space. It set this sort of theological and political framework of protection of a religious minority. But it varied widely over time and space across this vast region of the Middle East and North Africa, and over many, many different centuries. But the important thing to highlight for the purposes of this discussion is the obligation to protect that's part of dhimmi status, and also the fact that colonial interventions would often cite dhimmi status as a debased status and as a justification for intervention. So contestations over what that status really meant for the Jewish past in Morocco, specifically because Jews were the only major minority community, religious minority community in Morocco until the colonial period. The second major paradigm is that of convivencia. And this is where Eric Calderwood has done a bunch of really fantastic work, and Isabel Rohr has done some wonderful work in thinking about these romanticized notions of Jews in medieval Muslim Spain as having lived through this kind of golden age, as having thrived really in this sort of wonderful rose-colored golden age of intellectual and political thriving. And to an extent it's true, but to an extent it's overly romanticized. But Morocco lays claim to the heritage of convivencia. After the expulsion of Jews in 1492 in Morocco, in Spain rather, Morocco welcomed a large number of Jews from Spain, large numbers of them settling in northern Morocco. And so they settled throughout northern Morocco and also went into other parts of Morocco as well. And so that notion of convivencia is also super important for that idea of Jewish belonging in Morocco, and a nationalist narrative that would ultimately get revived during the 20th century of Morocco as a savior state for Jews. And then the final paradigm comes from the work of Daniel Schrader, the idea of the Sultan's Jew. It's the title of his 2002 book, The Sultan's Jew, Morocco and the Sephardi World, also from Stanford University Press. And it's no accident that my book title really is a riff off of his book title. He's aware of it and he's okay with it, because, and this is why it's a foundational paradigm, he writes about Jews serving as go-betweens between the Sultan in Morocco and between the Sultan in Morocco and different European diplomatic figures. He focuses on this one figure named Meir Mekneen at the very beginning of the 19th century, as a sort of representative of the Sultan abroad. And he writes about this as a kind of wider phenomenon, that there were other figures like Meir Mekneen that served in this representational capacity, but they were also in a possessive framework, right? That they belonged to the Sultan, they belonged to the state, and they functioned as these intermediaries for the state. So there's this sense of belonging in a possessive and in a national sense that's at work in the Sultan's Jew. And that's that dynamic that I'm pulling on for the Sultan's communists, and that dynamic that I argue becomes the ultimate patriotic framework for these pariahs turned national emblems over the course of the 20th century. But these paradigms, by the turn of the 20th century, and the beginning of colonial rule in 1912, were under threat. We see that different organizations such as the Alliance Israélite Universelle, founded in 1860, it had its first school. It was a Jewish philanthropic educational network based out of Paris, had its first school established in the northern Moroccan city of Tétouan in 1862. They argue there's a lot to say about the Alliance, but they, while their overt aim was to emancipate Jews wherever they were, to be best prepared citizens for their home countries, they did this through French language primarily, with very little education in home national languages until much later in the 20th century, and also kind of scant educational instruction in Hebrew, for that matter, in terms of a Jewish education. And the students in the Alliance were taught to memorize, for example, the map of France, and they were taught to really rigorously learn French literature and French history, but not so much in the Moroccan case, say local Moroccan history and the Moroccan map and Moroccan national poets or any of those sorts of things. And this is one example of the disruption of those sorts of pre-existing paradigms. Simon Levy, in an interview I did with him, once said that there were three things working over the Jews of Morocco, or sort of working to divorce them from the broader context. And he said one was the Alliance, one was Zionism, and one was colonialism. And that all these three elements working together had created a rupture between Moroccan Jews and Moroccan Muslims. So I'll briefly talk through, I think I may have already gone over my little 10 minutes, which is kind of shocking. But I'll briefly go through some of these characters and who they represent, and a couple of images of propaganda before wrapping up. But here is this image that I use in the introduction. It's a very iconic image for those of us familiar with Moroccan Jewish colonial history. This is from the time in 1912, the events that followed after the signing of the Treaty of the Protectorate in 1912, which resulted in military upheaval among Moroccan soldiers, raiding and pillaging of the Jewish quarter, which happened to abut the palace in Fez. The Jewish quarter is right next door to the royal palace in Fez. And Fez is where the first Moroccan Jewish quarter, known as Mellah, was formed. And the French, in response to that uprising, bombarded the Moroccan Jewish quarter, the Mellah, and basically leveled large portions of it, causing Moroccan Jews in Fez to flee to the palace gates. And they sought refuge in the Sultan's menagerie. And that's what you see here. And you see this lion behind bars, and some Jews occupying an animal cage, basically, right adjacent to the lion's cage. And the lion is one of the royal symbols of the Moroccan state, of the Makhzen, of the centralized Moroccan state. And I thought it might be a little bit too on the nose, but this is why I'm a historian and not a literary scholar. But I thought the symbolism was really ripe here of the sort of Moroccan lion behind bars, while the Jews were also sort of fleeing this new political status, inhabiting the lion cage next door, inhabiting the menagerie, and really highlighting from the beginning of the colonial period this mutual fate, in a way, or dependency of Moroccan Jews and the Moroccan state, and this question of what's going to happen between the dynamics, the previous pre-colonial and then the colonial dynamics of what will happen to this community under the new colonial rule. So the first person that I really talk about is Renee Sultan. He was born in Constantine, Algeria, before migrating ultimately to Morocco. And incidentally, the historian Josh Cole has written this wonderful book about this uprising and violent events in Constantine in 1934. And he cites somebody named Adolphe Sultan routinely in that. And I'm convinced that Adolphe Sultan is related to Sion Sultan, because it's not that common of a Jewish surname. Anyway, Sion Sultan started a law practice in Casablanca. He was already part of the left. And he ultimately became the first post-Second World War Secretary General of the Moroccan Communist Party. It had existed beforehand as a sort of Moroccan branch of the French Communist Party that wasn't particularly pro-independence. And after the Second World War, Sion Sultan, or not after, it was in 1943, so it's still during the Second World War, Sion Sultan takes over. But he then dies fighting for France, incidentally, at the head of a Moroccan troop brigade fighting in Germany. He suffers wounds, he's returned to Casablanca, and he dies of his wounds. But I used him to frame the first chapter because he really embodies so many of the different themes of somebody who is simultaneously a Zionist, a communist, and who was pro-French all at once. He sought to reform French colonial rule. He didn't want to overthrow it entirely. And that kind of combination, that fluidity of combination, would no longer be possible in the Second World War period. Second World War period is notable for the Vichy period. And here you just have a French newspaper that says the statute for Jews is promulgated. The Second World War period, I argue, served to really radicalize a lot of Moroccan Jews into different political trajectories that were no longer fluid and available mutually to one another. You could no longer be a Zionist, a communist, and a French nationalist. One had to choose one's political trajectory. And so we see this transformation of the party itself. It had been more of a popular front organization in the 1930s, becomes more of a national liberation organization in the post-war period. So its mission transforms from anti-fascism alone into the cause for Moroccan independence. Edmond Amran and Malé is really a wonderful example of the party's transformation in that second phase, in that post-war phase. And here he's writing against Zionist propaganda and Zionist incursions. He says, "We are Moroccans. We are not foreigners, as the Zionists would have us believe. We are deeply Moroccan." And he's writing this in 1949 in a communist newspaper called Espoir, or Hope, really trying to show this sense of ultimate belonging and pushing against any sort of Zionist claims to Moroccan Jews. Simon Levy, you've already met, but here's just a copy of his library card. I think it's always fun to have youthful images of people that got more famous in their elderly parts of their lives. So here's just his sort of library card. But he also became very prominent in the struggle for national liberation. And he cites the Second World War period as well as a sort of moment of galvanization, showing the weakness of France and the weakness of the French Republican promises to Jews, and his commitment to then fighting against those betrayals of France and fighting for the Moroccan nation. And here is his election poster from the 1970s as well. You'll note, for those of you who read Arabic, you'll note that it does not say Moroccan Communist Party at the top. It says the Party of Progress and Socialism, and that's because the party was banned at several different intervals and then resurfaced. And in this particular iteration, this is the PPS, the Party for Progress and Socialism, and it's still its current name for the party, lasting until today. This was the version of the party that was legalized under the post-independence regime of Hassan II, of King Hassan II, a very authoritarian regime that did not broker any room for leftist opposition. And so this was a fairly defanged but legalized way for the Moroccan Communist Party to continue in its political activities. People like Abraham Serfati rejected that defanged nature of the newly formed party, did not accept this weakened form of the party, and he left the PCM, he left that party and founded a further left party, Ila al-Amam, or Forward. And much to Simon Levy's chagrin, he took most of the students with him. As Simon Levy said, he brought sort of more of the youth with him. And this cover, he's on the cover of Jeune Afrique, or Young Africa here. It says, those who don't play the game, who don't just sort of kowtow to the regime. Abraham Serfati became a noted dissident. He ran afoul of the Moroccan regime, notably in 1975, especially, with his support for the Polisario Front in the Western Sahara conflict, whereas Simon Levy and the PPS really supported Morocco's claim to Western Sahara, and along with the majority of Moroccan Jews, really supported Morocco's claim to the Western Sahara. And this landed Abraham Serfati in prison for nearly 18 years, some of which was in solitary confinement. He was tortured in addition to that time period in solitary confinement. The final activist is Sion Asidon. He is still around today. He was of a generation that was inspired. He's the youngest of all of these figures. He was of a generation inspired by Abraham Serfati, who also rejected the Morocco's claim to Western Sahara. He's quite active today in criticizing the current politics of Morocco over the normalization of ties with Israel for the trade-off for Western Sahara. He also was in prison beside Serfati for quite a while. And I'll just sort of conclude with some images. I know I've got a little over the time, so I apologize, but these propaganda images are just too good not to share. Abraham Serfati ultimately became the figurehead of a major international human rights campaign in the 1990s. And here it says, in the country where the sun is king, women and men disappear in the shadow of the kingdom. Hassan II, King of Morocco, detains the longest serving political prisoner in the world since the liberation of Nelson Mandela, Abraham Serfati. So this is from the early 1990s, just before Abraham Serfati would ultimately be released from Morocco. Here's another fantastic piece of propaganda from the National Union of Students from Morocco in France, the Toulouse section. It says, in Morocco, there is more than just sunshine and oranges. There are also trials. And it shows, 150 centuries of collective prison sentences distributed. It's advocating for the liberation of all political prisoners in Morocco. And you see this picture of an orange with a Maroc or Morocco provenance sticker, like you pick it up in the grocery store in France, suggesting a capitalist complicity with buying this orange and entrapping the political prisoners that are inside of the orange by that continued blindness to the rampant human rights abuses going on in Morocco and the oppression of the left. Here is another piece of propaganda that shows torture sites and prison sites. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here you see these prisons and these little figures with a ball and chain scattered around Morocco. You see the exchange of workers going from Morocco into Europe. And here comes the tourist with his cowboy hat, shorts, and ridiculous camera coming in. And, you know, this is the exchange here, turning a blind eye once again to these human rights abuses. And here you see Abraham Serfati, in addition to many other noted, very prominent leftist activists. Okay, so to gear toward a conclusion of my long little spiel here. So Morocco today, Morocco today really fits its history of the Jewish past. There's this popular magazine, history magazine called Zman, or Time, that's often sold at train kiosks and little news kiosks around the country. And they've devoted, as you can see here, a number of major publications, issues to Jewish history and revolutionary Jewish history in particular. So it's rare today to not find some representation of Moroccan Jews in some press venue. I'm sure you'd be hard pressed if you went to a Moroccan news kiosk, at least one of the papers would have something about Moroccan Jews in them. And people like Sion Levy, right here is near his, a year after his death, a kind of obituary, Sion Levy, the death of a symbol, Moroccan Jew, anti-Zionist, anti-Islamist, and communist. He was unique unto himself. He died the 2nd of December in Rabat in 2011 and aged 77 years old. These people that I write about really became symbols of Morocco's tolerance in the wider Middle East and North Africa. And it's really notable, given some of the story I've told you about how they were at all different times imprisoned, attacked either by the French regime or the post-independence regime. And for them to become these symbols of the state, these ultimate symbols of belonging, is a really fascinating trajectory, I find. But thank you for your patience, and I look forward to the conversation, Chris.
Thanks, Alma. That was great. Where to begin? Because I wanted to begin in one place, and then you've taken us to so many different places. So I'm gonna ask you to go a little bit farther back, and then I wanted to bring us closer to the present moment, if that's okay. Because there's just a tremendous amount to think about. But I was wondering if you could give us a bit of the sort of the larger picture, even though you come to focus, of course, on these 5 figures. I was wondering if you could talk about the communism in Morocco in the 1930s, if we could start there. And I'm curious, sort of, I know you talk about this in the book, but I wanted to hear you speak about it a bit more. How Jewish was the Communist Party in Morocco at that point in time? And then, a related question that I would love for you to speak about in tandem with that first one is, given the subject matter, communism itself, I sort of just have this sort of, instead of workers of the world uniting, now scholars of the world uniting. How do you understand the sort of the non-engagement with the phenomenon you're about to describe until your book? It's like it's a non-engagement on the part of Jewish historians who focus on communism seemingly in every other context, but this one, scholars who focus on a history of Moroccan politics as well. So if you could give us a sort of the scene in the 1930s, and then maybe some thoughts about, why we've had to wait so long for you to reveal this story for us.
Yeah, thanks. So the 1930s, I love the 1930s. I'm thinking of doing a whole book just about the 1930s and politics in Morocco. And I'm really inspired by an article that Aomar Boum, who so generously introduced this program, wrote about an organization called the International League Against Anti-Semitism, which was very active in Morocco and in other parts of the Middle East and North Africa as well. And I mentioned them because they were part of a sort of popular front anti-fascist politics umbrella of the interwar period in Morocco that really gained steam into the 1930s, just before the outbreak of war, where the communists were really overlapping in their membership and some of their events with members of the Liga, with members of other leftist organizations. There were all these different human rights organizations that were operational. Even some Zionist organizations overlapped in all of this. And so the 1930s is fascinating as a kind of political soup that is so, I don't know, can I say soup is fluid? Depends on the soup. But a very fluid set of political options that Moroccan Jews had access to under this wide umbrella of anti-fascism. As fascism was gaining in popularity, both in France, obviously in Spain. There was the Spanish Civil War going on in the latter part of the 1930s, and in Morocco as well, among settler colonials, we see a growth of fascism, pro-fascist ideas. And so the 1930s really serve as this, initially when I had written the first draft of the first chapter, I was thinking of it as the kind of, here's setting the stage for the real action that's going to take place in the Second World War onward. But the more I thought about it, that time period of the interwar period is just so rich with all of these different possibilities for political activism. So the Communist Party itself was just one of many, many anti-fascist organizations that was active then. And it's through that anti-fascist activism that many Jews came to the Moroccan Communist Party. And as to your second question, and interrupt me if I didn't answer the first one adequately, but as to the second question, so much of the historiography of Moroccan Jews until relatively recently has focused on Jews who left, or the cause of trying to unpack the causes of why Jews left Morocco. And it's true, the vast majority of Jews did leave Morocco. I am writing about a tiny minority of people that happened to shed light on wider frameworks and happenings in Morocco. But the vast majority of Moroccan Jews left and had nothing to do with communist politics. And that's really important to point out. I'm not making a claim that all of these Moroccan Jews were so involved in the Moroccan Communist Party and chose to stay. But I think there have been a few books starting in the 1990s with Joel Bainan and Zach Lockman's work on Jews and communist politics in Egypt and in Palestine, Orit Bashkin's work on Jews and communist politics in Iraq, Lior Sternfeld's work on Jews and communist politics in Iran, Pierre-Jean Lefol-Luciani's work on Jews and nationalist and communist politics in Algeria. I mean, all of these things. Right now we're at the stage of there's kind of like one per country. And, Camelia Rahamouni is working on one of Jews and communists in Tunisia. But that's sort of part of that longer trajectory starting in the 1990s of looking beyond just the story of flight and trying to see what else is going on too.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I was thinking about, in particular, Morocco as sort of a potential case study that would have seemed to have leapfrogged the others, perhaps. But I think you're right to situate it in that broader moment with all the scholarship that you mentioned. And so, is the height of Jewish engagement with communist politics, would you date that to the interwar period? Is it post World War II? When is sort of, even though we're talking about a minority within a minority, when is it? When do we have sort of the greatest representation of Jews in communist politics?
Yeah, I would say during the Second World War, the immediate post-Second World War period, the sort of late 40s, early 1950s, is really the height of Jews in the Moroccan Communist Party. And you see this in membership rosters. I mean, there are all sorts of avenues that I didn't pursue in the book. I mean, there was a really active section in Oujda For example, on the border with Algeria, and the head of the local section there was a Jewish guy. The head of many different local sections were Jews. And you can see sort of on membership rosters, a number of Jews that are involved there. So it's really during that time period. And then it's after independence where the membership starts to wane. There are a few potential explanations for that, but one of them is just that other organizations were more savvy in capturing students and in maintaining connections to the labor unions and their needs than the Moroccan Communist Party was. And that's because the Moroccan Communist Party, for all of its rhetoric, really the top leadership came from a more privileged socioeconomic class for the most part, and didn't necessarily always represent the workers, despite the way they projected themselves.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so okay, so we have engagement in the 1930s, galvanization during World War II, and perhaps it's a sort of height of Jewish engagement during the Second World War, and then immediately after as well. I love the discussion of those who remained, right? I mean, such a large group of people that also hasn't been the focus as it has for those who have departed. And especially when we're talking about the 1950s and 1960s, we're not necessarily talking about a small group of people. I mean, depending on the time, we're talking about well over 100,000 Moroccan Jews remaining in country after independence. I was wondering if you could discuss the motivations for those who remain. I mean, some of it is certain political agendas, but how do you come to understand those who remain in country in the 1950s after 1956?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the group. For the communists, it's this very sincere patriotic commitment to remaining in Morocco. Although somebody like Enmon Amran al-Maleh chooses to leave after this major upheaval in 1965 in Casablanca, which was a student protest that morphed into wider grievances that was then very brutally put down by the Moroccan government. And he chose to leave for France at that point and didn't return until the death of King Hassan II. But for the communists, it was this sincere moment of patriotism and wanting to remain and be active in Morocco. And they saw leaving Morocco as a betrayal of these ideological promises. For others, it's more mundane concerns like uprooting family networks, property, right? What does somebody own? In Morocco, for many, moving to Israel, which was what the majority choice wasn't such an appealing option. They heard reports back of what life was like for Moroccan Jews in Israel and thought it would not work for them. The wealthier went to France in different intervals, but for the Moroccan communist Jews, it was really this very, very deep-seated ideological commitment, despite, I write a lot about the differences between the Morocco that they imagine and the Morocco that they want to see take shape in the future versus the Morocco that was actually taking shape around them. They still maintain this idealistic patriotism.
Yeah, I'm struck by, it was so interesting to read some of the PCM literature produced by Jews, or perhaps not, but just perhaps produced by the PCM, but for the Jewish community in the 1950s that you cite and you describe. And it's so fascinating because some of it feels so not in touch with the daily lived experiences of the community. And as you said, it's a diverse community that's in a state of flux. Even sort of internally in Morocco, people moving from the hinterland to places like Casablanca and elsewhere. I don't know. Would you speak about some of those outreach efforts and how you understand them? Am I reading them incorrectly? Do they not miss the mark? I mean, what was
No, they totally missed the mark.
Okay. How do you understand the sort of the attempt to woo more of the Jewish community in the 1950s?
Yeah, they attempt to woo by chastising Moroccan Jews, basically. In this propaganda, in these leaflets, they attack Jews for ever entertaining any Zionist convictions or ever reading anything, maybe Zionist, that they're not doing enough to show their patriotism. They're really kind of nagging the majority Moroccan Jewish community for not doing enough, for not being active enough, for ever entertaining any other political beliefs. And it's definitely not a soft attempt at persuasion. It's very aggressive as a mode of engagement. And so it wasn't particularly persuasive to most Moroccan Jews. And they saw these figures as dissidents that could only reflect poorly on the majority Moroccan community, that could put them in trouble. And that's why, Jews don't do politics, as Edmond Amran al-Maleh sort of facetiously wrote in one of his novels, was this idea of just not ruffling feathers. And here were these Jews ruffling feathers and insulting the majority Jewish community in the process of trying to convince them. So no, you're totally on the mark with that. It's a very aggressive mode of attempted persuasion.
Yeah, and I'm struck by also, you quote Simon Levy as sort of coming to understand that, I don't know, perhaps later in life, but you quote him in your chapter Tactics as talking about I think he describes what he describes as the inertia of the Moroccan Jewish community, or sort of a standing to the sides, or perhaps like a wait and see approach. And yet he's also, it seems, quite aware that the majority of the community, in your words and discussing him, remain faithful to the sovereign, right? Yeah. Remain faithful to the Sultan. So it also feels like we're talking about politics on so many different levels here, right? There's sort of politics within political parties, and there's sort of the left of that spectrum, and then there's also this recognition, at least by figures of like Levy, that there's another expression of politics that doesn't involve political parties, but that does demonstrate a certain allegiance to the figure of a sultan. And I found that, again, fascinating, but also, there's something almost troubling about sort of the some of the ideological commitment getting in the way of some of the perhaps some of the pragmatism, some of the outreach. So I'd love to think through that with you, or get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, and your work shows this as well, right? When in your Ijmis article, right, you have these very prominent Moroccan Jewish singers who are singing the benefits of the Sultan, right? And seeing the Sultan's exile and return as tragic moments, right? So you see this well beyond the strictly political sphere, although music can be political too, obviously, and often is. But it's this fascinating thing. And the moment of the Green March in 1975 really showcases that dynamic, where even Moroccan Jews abroad in Israel come out in high support for the Moroccan annexation of Western Sahara. You see Moroccan Jews in Canada and in like New York and all of these places prominently supporting the king's decision to do this. And Simon Levy was really proud of being one of the first to set foot as part of the Green March in Western Sahara. And he writes in this one op-ed that he's so glad to see Moroccan Jews finally participating He says, better late than never. He's glad to see that this is such a popular cause among Moroccan Jews. And that, he writes about how in Moroccan Jewish schools, they were talking about the Western Sahara and supporting it. And so there are these moments of Moroccan Jewish solidarity with the sovereign, even among those that have left, which is really interesting. And that still continues to this day in different formats, which is a fascinating phenomenon as well.
Yeah, how does Levy, how does he square that politics of supporting the Green March and his communist past?
Yeah, and one could say, how are any of these people communists and supporting a monarchy? There are different versions of that question. And, for many communist parties in the Middle East and North Africa and in other parts of the world, they were parties for national liberation. And it wasn't necessarily the strict Stalinism of what somebody might be more used to hearing about in the Eastern European context. It's a different kind of relationship to Moscow. Although Edmond Amado, by the time he leaves the party, is criticizing its knee-jerk Stalinism and says, how can you do this after 1956, basically. So Simon Levy, for him, it's all about patriotism, and the Communist Party was the way of being patriotic. Istiklal wasn't, some Jews joined Istiklal, but among those Jews who were politically active in the national liberation movement, more of them joined the Moroccan Communist Party than the Istiklal Party or other competing national liberation parties, because these other parties were often predicated on a vision of Islam and Moroccanness, and the Communist Party didn't have that component. So in some cases, it seems like Simon Levy disregarded Marxist orthodoxy in order to pursue patriotic goals. In others, you see Marxism being muscled to justify something like the Green March. It's actually the liberation. It's the end of colonialism. It's not a colonial takeover of another people. This is recompense. So there are a number of different kinds of ideological gymnastics that are possible around these questions.
Yeah, and I think you do a great job of showing those gymnastics over the long durée of this history. About you describe it as multivariability, and I think you can see it here as well. I want to just ask you a few more questions, cognizant of a clock that I'm not actually watching. I wanted to ask you. You follow 5 figures in this book. I wanted to ask you to maybe speak about someone you would have wanted to include, but you left out. I don't know who that could be. I'm thinking about Abraham Tsarfati's sister, Evelyn, who you mentioned. Who were you eager to include in the book, but just couldn't for whatever reason?
Yeah, there are so many women that I really would have liked to include more of, and they are notoriously more difficult to find in the archive. And this is something that your work does so well, because there were so many female pop stars, Jewish pop stars that you can cite, but the female communist activists faded into the background quite a bit more. And so it's harder to dig up information about them. And everything I have about Evelyn Sarfati comes through Abraham Sarfati, or some other some police document that doesn't really go in depth about her. They just say she's a secretary, or something, or she drove a getaway car or something like that. So she's one of them. Simon Levy's wife was quite active in her own way, and I did interview her. I had the really good fortune of interviewing her, but she always was saying that, why are you asking me these questions? My husband was really the one who was so prominent. And I think that was very common, unfortunately, for a lot of wives of these prominent political figures. So there are lots of people that I would have liked to include in it that didn't make it in.
It was incredible, the connection between Simon Levy's wife and Aliata's wife were sisters as well. It's incredible. I mean,
this first family of communist politics.
The intimacy of the story. I mean, I know you're focusing on a minority within a minority, but now we're talking about an extended family at certain moments, which is unbelievable. Yeah. I wanted to end with a couple of things. The first is toward the end of the book, you refer to the commodification of Moroccan Jewish culture. And I wanted you to say more about that. Who is it commodified for? In what context? And then I'm curious, to dare we bring us to the near present moment? What is this commodification look like in light of normalization or so-called normalization between Morocco and Israel that Omar Boum mentioned at the outset of our talk? So, the commodification of Moroccan Jewish culture, and how does that manifest today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, starting in the 1980s, really the late 70s, early 80s, there was the beginning of Moroccan Jewish tourism and heritage tours, particularly of Israelis of Moroccan descent returning. And the anthropologist André Levy writes about this in his book, Return to Casablanca, really brilliantly, about the double position of being an Israeli anthropologist of Moroccan origin who is working on his home community and attends these heritage tours and different saint shrine pilgrimages, the Hilulot. And so there's these sort of packages, tourist packages that Oren Kazansky and Omar Boum have written about too, about, how these different tourist groups are appealed to, different pamphlets, return to this land of sunshine. And, you'll see the traditional Jewish sites. Edmond Amran El-Maleh lampoons this kind of tourism in one of his books, in which there's a Moroccan Jew who had gone to Israel and then ultimately makes his way to New York, and he goes with his Ashkenazi girlfriend on one of these tours. And she's always using these diminutives with him, like, oh, my little Moroccan, and these sorts of things with him. And then he loses it essentially on this tour. He gets really drunk on mahia, this fig liqueur. Is it fig or is it date? Do you remember?
Fig, yeah.
Fig liqueur. This mahia, and he gets drunk and he goes off on this tangent about how, no, we were duped by the Zionists. Nothing was so awful, and when we got to Israel, they called us troglodytes and that we lived in caves. And the point being that there's been a long past of Moroccan Jewish tourism and commodification of the Moroccan Jewish past. And you see in different media outlets this sort of overly rosy picture of Moroccan Jewish life that, the opposite of the neo-lacrimose view that Mark Cohen wrote about, ripping off of Salo Baron. That, instead of everything being one long slog of terrible until Zionism or emancipation saved the Jews, instead, everything was great until colonialism, until Zionism. But look, now we still have thriving Jewish life, and the Moroccan kingdom protects its Jews. Come and see. And so, there are so many synagogue groups across the United States that plan trips to Morocco as Jewish trips that, would normally go to other locations around Eastern Europe as well, right? So it's becoming part of a global Jewish touristic circuit. And so that's really what I mean by commodification. And the figures that I write about as emblems of state tolerance by the end of their lives are part of that process.
Is Asidon beyond commodification, or is he part of this as well?
Yeah.
Beyond.
Oh, good question. Asidon well beyond. Yeah, he is a vociferous critic of the government. He is not part of that commodification. Yeah, he is definitely not. I mean, he's written about sometimes as, look at one of these Jews in Morocco today, but he is currently one of the most vocal critics of the normalization of ties with Israel.
Yeah, you had that mild picture that might have spoken otherwise, but point taken. Let me end by asking you about the conclusion, which you title "Scarification," and I'm wondering here, you're taking this from Amado, and you'll speak about that, but I'm wondering as well about the symbolism here and what the body is here that is being modified through this process of scarification.
Yeah, I mean, the body is the narrative of the Moroccan Jewish past, right? What it is, how do we tell the story of Moroccan Jews, especially across the 20th century? And so El-Maleh talks about it in the sense of he's writing about Jews who left and Jews who return and the history of authoritarian politics in Morocco, and talks about, the scars we hide, the scars we don't hide, but being visible nonetheless. And, talking about those in Morocco trying to hide the scars or not hide the scars. And so I thought it worked as a conclusion because, there are lots of different modes of thinking about histories that are visible behind other histories. Palimpsests are one of the most popular examples of that. But I thought scarification worked in that it can be very deliberate as a beautiful kind of tattoo, right? Scarification doesn't necessarily have to be a violent process. And so it can deal with narrative making, narrative construction, as well as addressing the violences of the past, and showing, that some things should be revealed, right? And that some of the scarification doesn't need to be hidden, can be shown and can be introduced into the wider narrative of Moroccan Jews or Jews of the Middle East and North Africa.
Great, thank you. So I just want to thank you again for a wonderful conversation. It's a fantastic book, which I've marked up with many notes, and I'm going to be referring back to for quite some time. So congratulations, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for your questions. Thank you.